Global warnings over a new terror group. Who are they and what do they want? Hi everyone, I'm Sean Calebson filling in for Anand Naidu and you're watching The Heat. The emergence of a new militant organization is raising alarms throughout Afghanistan. The Islamic State Khorasan, or ISK, is taking responsibility for several deadly attacks across the country since the Taliban took control 2 years ago. Security analysts say it's an ISIL affiliate and it's targeting Afghan government officials, religious leaders, as well as others. ISK carried out the Kabul airport suicide bombing during the chaotic U.S. withdrawal back in 2021. There are now concerns that the group could expand into the South and Central Asia and even potentially strike the U.S. and other nations. Let's find out more about this, and for that we're going to bring in our panel. Joining us here in Washington, D.C., Marvin Weinbaum. He is the Director of Afghanistan and Pakistan Studies at the Middle East Institute. From Michigan, Saeed is a lecturer in Near East and Asian Studies at Wayne State University. Out of Pennsylvania, Clarke, the Director of Research at the Soufan Group, and Omar. He is the former Afghan ambassador to France, as well as Canada, and a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's South Asia Center. I want to welcome all of you. A lot to get to. I want to kind of jump right into it. Omar, if I could begin with you. Let's begin talking about ISK, Islamic State Khorasan. The brand name this terror group is going by. First got its toehold in Iraq, then Syria. So I guess not a huge surprise that it has moved on with all the instability into Afghanistan, but it was there before the U.S. withdrawal, but it has since become much more of an influence in that region. Kind of bring me up to speed, how it got there to this point, and who you think ISK is really targeting at this point, and can they do little more than just embarrass the Taliban government?
Well, I will try my best since we're dealing with a phenomena that is shrouded in secrecy most of the time, and it sometimes changes colors. But obviously, as you said in the beginning of your program, it is considered as an affiliate of the original Islamic State that we saw in the Middle East. And then around end of 2014-15, and I happened to be in Kabul at that time in government, it surfaced in Afghanistan, but not just inside Afghanistan, mostly along the Afghan-Pakistan tribal belt, but also it found some sanctuaries in northern Afghanistan, mostly southeast and east of Afghanistan, along the border with Pakistan, as I said. They were made up mostly not so much of the Middle Eastern types. There were a few who probably came along and settled in this region and saw the end of the American NATO presence in Afghanistan and wanted to take advantage of whatever vacuum they thought was going to emerge in that region. They are made up mostly of disgruntled former militants belonging to different groups, Central Asian terrorist groups, South Asian terrorist groups, some former Pakistani Taliban, even some probably disgruntled Afghan Taliban, and maybe Al-Qaeda and other Arab groups. So it's a mix which has found some space in Afghanistan and along the border with Pakistan, but they at times have been put under pressure. They have lost men and influence. And recently, of course, after the Taliban takeover, they have tried to regroup and make a name for themselves and offer an alternative to the Taliban, which of course is not welcomed by most Afghans, because the Afghans are somewhat tired of all these groups running around in their country.
Yeah, Marvin, I want to bring you in. I was in Afghanistan last July and August, marking the year anniversary of the U.S. Withdrawal. And at that point, one thing that was bouncing around in the area that some people had joined that terror group, ISIL-K, ISK, whatever it's being called at this moment, because they were frustrated that the current Taliban government wasn't going far enough in a lot of its, very conservative beliefs. And then also you take into with the fact that the way the U.S. withdrawal played out, just losing control of that nation much quicker than anybody thought would happen. And then the Taliban releasing many prisoners who did find a home with the terror group. Tell me how this equation is really leading to some of the troubles in that area right now.
Well, let me correct that in the sense that the release of Taliban by the Taliban, this is not really what happened. It was a release by the previous government during the negotiations process, which led to the U.S. withdrawal. That's when perhaps some 1,500 Taliban, ISK were released and have had an enormous influence, many people believe. But let's recognize that the group itself is not very large.
Right.
We don't have any good figures on this. It varies anywhere from 1,000 to 6,000. But it's been a group which nevertheless has been, because in part and increasingly so, very good at its strategic communications, at its propaganda wing, and has really created more of a sense of threat than really perhaps is warranted, at least for the present time. And I would just add to that the fact that I think over the long run, it may very well emerge as something much more concerning, but not at present.
Saeed, Khan, let's talk more about that because the figures that I read back in July and August that the Taliban in Afghanistan at that time was only about 100,000. And think about how it could control a nation of 35, 37 million people. So what can 6,000 insurgents do if their goal is simply to disrupt the government and make it very difficult for them to gain any kind of credibility or gain any kind of foothold within that nation of actually finding a way to govern it?
Well, a country like Afghanistan has had so many challenges regarding security. And of course, any kind of stability is going to be seen as something very welcomed by the public. Now, of course, there are some major issues with the way the Taliban tries to maintain security. Certainly in the West, it is being seen as being highly authoritarian, highly repressive. But in the case of ISK, all it really needs to do is, as Marvin said, exploit its strategic communications and then strategically go ahead and target areas in a random way, so it is keeping the Afghan people on its toes. And more broadly, I would argue even Central Asia as well, that one doesn't know where it's going to strike, what kind of targets it's going to strike. It seems in many ways it's very indiscriminate. The fact that it targets civilians, the fact that it targets other Muslims, not just Shia, but also Sunnis, targeting Salafis, targeting clerics, targeting mosques, foreign embassies, like an attempt on the Turkmenistan embassy, firing into both Tajikistan as well as Uzbekistan. What it then creates is a chilling effect, certainly when it comes to foreign investment, as well as the economic well-being of Afghanistan. They really don't have the ability then to wonder, how is this organization going to provide any kind of semblance of, for lack of better terms, a good night's sleep? And especially if the Taliban is incapable of controlling or containing the ISK threat, that then creates certainly more than just a moral panic within Afghanistan.
And Saeed, I want to follow up, and I want to play you a soundbite from Ashwander Mir of the Wilson Center. He spoke with Outlook India recently, talking about how, I'm sorry, it's a graphic I'm going to read to you about how ISK is the sworn enemy of the Taliban and its goal really to disrupt things. Here's that quote. ISIS-K subscribes to the jihadi Salafism ideology and plays up the purity of its anti-idolatry credentials. The Taliban, on the other hand, subscribe to an alternative Sunni Islamic sectarian school and the Hanafi Madhab, which ISIS-K regards as deficient. The two groups also differ over the role of nationalism, ISIS-K fiercely rejecting it, which runs counter to the Afghan Taliban's aims of ruling over Afghanistan. I want to get your thoughts on that.
Sure. I think that all the ideological rhetoric and flourishes aside, one of the main complaints that ISK has against the Taliban is the fact that they are still having a rapprochement with foreign governments. It's, of course, important to remember that the Taliban foreign minister met with a Chinese foreign minister just prior to the U.S. withdrawal in August of 2021. There does seem to be some interest, of course, for China to have ties with Kabul, recognizing perhaps de facto the Taliban regime. This is seen as being a rather blasphemous act, if you will, for ISK, that they have these kinds of rapport. The fact that ISK actually says that the Taliban is a puppet for the United States shows you then the kind of extremism of rhetoric that ISK uses. ISK, of course, also targeting China for what it sees as China's alleged treatment of the Uyghur in Xinjiang province, the fact that it wants to then establish a caliphate going all the way from the various Central Asian stands, including what it calls East Turkestan or Western China, all the way down to the Maldives, means that this is an area that is at play and it's within the sights of ISK. And the Taliban, of course, are one of its major obstacles in achieving that goal.
Colin, thanks very much for being so patient to bring you in now. Let's talk a little bit about that, how we got to this point now. A lot of people who don't follow the ins and outs of this every day are probably wondering, okay, what's the difference between ISIL? What's the difference between Al-Qaeda? What's the difference between the Islamic State? Kind of give me a thumbnail sketch of where we are in Afghanistan and what the people of that area should be concerned about, especially in those tribal areas that we talked about at the top of the program.
Yeah, so since the Islamic State Corps, or ISIS Central in Iraq and Syria, lost the last of its territory around Baghouz in March 2019, there's been a decentralization to the affiliates, the branches, the franchise groups all over the world. I wrote a book called After the Caliphate, where I kind of looked at what all these different regional branches stood for. How powerful were they? Where might they be headed in the future? And that book, which I published in 2019, projected that ISIS-K would be among the most potent of all the affiliates. And I feel, even more strongly in that sense, given where we are now. This is a group with transnational objectives. All you need to do is look at its propaganda. It tells you exactly what it feels, and I think we need to listen to these groups. It also has the capabilities, which are growing. If you listen to CENTCOM General Kurilla talked about just recently in March, saying, they could be 6 months out from a transnational capability. So this is in the broader constellation of jihadi groups. I would put ISK at the very top of groups that we need to worry about in Europe and the West more broadly.
Okay, Colin, let's follow up on that, because you paint some real concerns there and talking about being the most potent insurgent group out there, or perhaps right now. What should, not just people in Afghanistan, but what should people all over be concerned about? We've read that U.S. generals are concerned that perhaps within 6 months, 8 months, a year, these ISK could lash out at the United States or other areas in the West.
Look, we know, go back to April 2020, there was an ISK plot to work through the Central Asian diaspora in Europe to target U.S. military bases in Germany. So the intent is there. They're growing the capability. I think what we should be concerned about, in the U.S., I think civilians everywhere, is, the fact that bandwidth is stretched. Everybody is paying close attention, and rightfully so, to the conflict in Ukraine. All the conversation is about great power competition between the United States and China, to a lesser extent Russia. And, resources have shifted significantly, particularly post-COVID, back to, thinking about nation states, and counterterrorism in many ways has been de-emphasized. And that's a concern in and of itself.
Omar, when I was there 6, 8 months ago, a lot of people were, of course, decrying what was going on with women. girls with education. So many human rights being rolled back after 20 years of U.S.-led involvement in that area. But what can terror do to a country? One where the Taliban government, under circumstances when there wasn't another insurgent group in the wing somewhere, could they be able to govern that nation well? And secondly, just kind of dig into what terror does to a nation, because people are so fed up with fighting in that area, even with all the human rights abuses or being wiped away. A lot of people said, you know, I don't have to walk out the door and be concerned about being killed today. But that is going away.
Well, I mean, we all know very well what terror can do. I mean, we saw on 9/11 what terror did here in the United States, and we've had so many other examples of what terror has done across the world. In Afghanistan, you know, a country that has been in conflict for 45 years, we have had different phases of terror in different forms. We had red terror, black terror, we have had all kinds of terror. And the Afghan people, that's why I was saying, are obviously not going to support anybody. So ISK, in my opinion, following up on what the others said, is an opportunistic, extremist, radicalized, of course, Islamist group that uses terror as a means, as its key means of trying to disrupt society and make it difficult for its rivals. So its first intent is to make sure that its rivals, like the Taliban, feel pressure. And then it's trying to recruit as much as it can. But the one thing that is very interesting is that the Taliban have shown that they're fighting ISK across Afghanistan. Just in the past week, they were able to eliminate ISK hideouts in Balkh, in Nimroz, in Herat today. And they also find a lot of arms and money that goes along with this. So the question comes, where is the support system for ISK? I mean, you can't just operate in a vacuum. You have to have training, you have to be able to recruit, you have to be able to pay, you have to be able to feed, you have to be able to do the logistics that are needed. It's not easy, as we saw with even the Taliban,
right,
who are Afghans and who were in insurgency, and took them more than 20 years to accomplish their goals. So in this case, I think the Taliban are more concerned about ISK than anybody else. And this offers an opportunity maybe for some deeper discussions beyond what was done in Doha between the United States and the Taliban to address this counterterrorism issue. And in my opinion, I think there is an opportunity, but obviously the Taliban have to play ball and they have to continue and they have to agree to pursue talks on counterterrorism. And others can pitch in as well, because there are many other countries in the region and beyond who also consider ISK as a threat to their interests.
Marvin, let's pick up a bit on what Omar has been talking about, saying, you know, perhaps the Taliban isn't that concerned, that they have been able to root out some of these places, but they have really spread basically to all 34 provinces to some degree. And the Taliban is dismissing, of course, ISK, basically saying, we have this under control, they're not a threat to us. Do you believe that? And kind of build on what you were talking about earlier, that maybe it's not the threat right now that everybody's talking about.
Well, they have representation, if you will. They have forces, small groups, in I think about 16 of the provinces that we are able to determine. But I really believe that we have to look at the group now here as an urban guerrilla group. Essentially, this is where they're focused at the present time, because this has the greatest impact in trying to undermine this government. What they're really interested in is not to replace the Taliban. They realize that they're not capable of anything of this order. But what they do want to increase is their ability here to recruit and ultimately to drive wedges within the Taliban. And I think there's a great deal of this creation of insecurity, and also in that process to offer to those who are potential dissidents within the organization another place to land if they decide to break from this government. So they're really counting here as best they can. at opportunities here by stirring up as much anxiety as they can here, and to see that and to have them pick up wherever they could. And I think a lot of the differences here are not so much theoretical or theological as they are political. They're looking for ways by criticizing the Taliban to draw off people who may be unhappy with the current regime.
Let's follow up on that, Marvin, because right now Afghanistan has a world of problems. It's got widespread hunger. It's got very tremendous difficulty trying to grow enough crops to feed its nation. And even if they do have it, people don't have the money to buy them. Jobs are withering. Does this create a very ripe environment for ISK to perhaps reach out to some of these people who are disappointed with the way things have gone the past 2 years, and the fact that the United States still has millions and millions of dollars of Afghan central bank money frozen? Can the Afghan Taliban government move forward in a convincing fashion without having the funds needed?
Well, they're actually, in some respects, doing better than we thought they could in terms of meeting basic needs here to run their regime. Obviously, they don't believe they can aspire to have the kind of modern economy, nor do they want the kinds of institutions that we really have thought that they would. You know, we've had a sense here that we had leverage over the Taliban, that by denying them recognition, by keeping development assistance and other forms of assistance from them, that they would be willing to alter their policies. But this regime, what is demonstrating, and I think it's important to understand for the region, that we value certain kinds of development and institutions in a way that they don't. They have their own concept here about what a authentic Islamic state should look like, and I think the same is true for ISK. And I'm going to want to just stress the fact that I think a lot of what ISK's criticism here really is just merely to differentiate themselves from this government, and in the process to be in a better position to be the recipients of support, which at the present time in a grassroots sense does not exist for them.
Saeed, when I went over there, I've been going to Afghanistan since 2001, been there many, many times. The first time I went under Taliban rule was this past summer. I was concerned about what we would find on the ground. When we met with Ministry of Foreign Affairs, they gave us a letter and said, we can guarantee your safety anywhere in the country. And we took advantage of it, drove all through the Paktika Mountains, areas that all the times I'd not even seen from the air, and then drove through Wardak and other areas. So seemingly the government was able to reach out to the Taliban faithful, basically saying, leave the Western journalist alone. The situation's different now on the ground. If you look at the number of attacks that happened back in 2020 compared to the number of attacks now, what is this instability, which is almost insane to talk about instability and saying the Taliban government could be the stable one, but what is this instability going to do to that country? And is it the kind of thing that could lead to the one brick falling, two bricks falling, and then you see dominoes and the whole thing kind of going?
Well, I don't think that the dominoes are going to fall to the point where, as has been mentioned before, ISK is going to replace the Taliban. But the fact that there's going to be then a state of chaos where the Taliban is going to have to use your metaphor, start to go ahead and put the dominoes back into a certain order and stability, means that the opportunity cost is that the Taliban is then not going to be able to deliver on what it has professed that it would do, which is righting the ship, providing security for all Afghans, hopefully at a certain point bringing a bit of economic viability to the country. Disruption, distraction are, of course, what ISK wants to do. And unfortunately, with this escalation, that is something in which they're succeeding.
Colin, just kind of look into the crystal ball, if you will, for a minute. Tell me what we're looking at in the coming months and perhaps a couple of years down the road. Is ISK going to be limited to launching terror attacks at a cricket match or when an official drives through a certain area, or could it be something worse?
Look, I think it's a combination of the low-level attacks that we've seen, the opportunistic attacks. I mean, some really heinous stuff targeting a maternity ward, which is, among the most heinous you could imagine, all the way to going after the Chinese, the Pakistanis, the Russians. And I think, IS sees talking about it as an opportunistic organization and one that engages in actual organizational learning. They see an opportunity to separate themselves from the pack, so to speak. And what better way to do that than a large-scale attack in the West to kind of put them in the upper echelon within this broader constellation of jihadi groups. So they tell us that's what they want to do. In the past, we've often kind of neglected to listen to these groups or take them seriously. I think we need to. I think the U.S. is a bit more insulated than Europe, but we have to be on high alert. I mean, we've worked for the last 2 decades. There's no point in letting our guard down now. I know there's a lot of things going on with Ukraine and elsewhere, but we focus on counterterrorism.
And Colin, one quick follow-up. Let's talk about how media savvy these organizations are now, because clearly the Taliban in control now is not the Taliban from 2001. Very efficient on the web, getting information out. So 6,000 people with ISK, those tentacles can reach out very, very far.
Look, without question, with the proliferation of emerging technologies, these groups use end-to-end encryption. They use various communication technologies as force multipliers. And we saw ISIS really pioneer the art of recruiting through social media. This was a very savvy, very sophisticated group in terms of the messages they sent. They segmented to different audiences, almost in the way a Madison Avenue marketing firm would do.
Saeed, I want to give you the last word here. Your thoughts, your concerns as everything moves forward. We only have about a minute left, but kind of give me your thoughts for way things are going to play out, perhaps in the next year over there.
Well, I think that really all depends on what some of the neighboring and regional countries and what some of the powers that feel threatened by ISK want to do about it. The irony is that the United States doesn't really have any partners in the region. It really doesn't have any intelligence gathering of note. It might find itself having to begrudgingly work with the Taliban. But other countries that do have good relations with the Taliban, including China, I think it would behoove them to then help out the Taliban, because perhaps one of the best ways to defeat ISK is at least to contain them in Afghanistan. If ISK becomes metastatic to the rest of Central Asia, then it's going to become a far more complex and complicated issue that we're going to have.
We're going to have to leave it there. We only have about 15 seconds left. I want to thank my panel for being here. We're going to leave it there. I'm Sean Caleb's in Washington, D.C. As always, thanks for watching The Heat.